Um, I vote negative in the debate, and I think that one of the things that is important at the end of the debate is that reminding me what exactly the plan does. Like, you end drone strikes, you put statutory limitations on drone. Like, what are you doing exactly, and why is that a good government action, right? Because the argument that the negative is making is that government actions are anti-black and are continuously creating forms of racism against bodies that get marked as black. And so in the 2AR, there's a couple examples of different laws, but none of those laws are your law, so you're not necessarily being specific. And the 2NR does well is that you explain, like, in relation to the advantages, how othernization of the black body is what then allows us to create terrorists and take other ones, which means that there's a specific application of how the way that you just sort of label populations then become like that. And so you have the argument that it's like, well, this is Middle Eastern, but there's, like, you say that this is Middle Eastern. I guess that like, when you say that and then you're like, well, therefore they're making it a race issue because it has to be black. To me, that shows that it's not necessarily just a straight black-white issue, but there's different gradations of blackness that are part of the spectrum. So being Middle Eastern and having a brown body is marked as brown as a little bit closer to white, but still within a black body that has different forms of discrimination. And so, like, when they say it's not a race, it means that, like, people who are foreign, like yourself, like, you get the advantages and the privileges of being a white woman, but as soon as you start to talk, people hear an accent, and then suddenly there's a markation of being different. And so their argument is that comes from the being marked as black first, and then that's how other forms of discriminations come down the line. I think that, though, when you say it's not a race issue, I think it's not a race issue, but it also is a race issue, right? Because it's like there is a skin color element that does go into it, but that skin color element does not then structure identically how all oppression then operates. So it's like the black body gets marked because it is seen as black, but what is seen as black changes over different times and places. So what is black in one place is not necessarily black in another place, but the way that discrimination operates is through that idea of the black body. And so you can think of ideas like all sorts of, like, cultural media influences, like, Star Wars has Luke Skywalker always in white versus Darth Vader always in black. The good guys are in white, the bad guys are in black. And this isn't a race issue, but it marks blackness as always being bad. And then when race gets read in ways where there's blackness involved, then that also has that form of discrimination that takes place. So it's not a race issue, but it's been linked up there. So there's evidence you can read that indicates that, like, the Middle Eastern oppression is different than blackness as a form of oppression, and then you can make those forms of arguments that would then explain that how it's not that, but rather it's religion or it's Orientalism that then structures oppressions like blackness. But you don't have that analysis really in the debate. You're just sort of like, oh, well, there's this Middle Eastern thing going on, and you're doing a good job sort of explaining why blackness controls it at the root. What I think that sort of exists in the earlier portions of the debate but doesn't go on later on is that you start by having a framework where policy making is good, and that's really the majority of the 2AC offense, is that policy making is good. And you don't address that as fully as you should as well. Like, because initially part you're making arguments about fairness and education and things like that, but when you get to when you're initially answering this stuff, you're not then explaining when they say it's unfair, it's bad for education. You're not pointing back to where you said, no, what you've done is bad for education. So lining up why the black framework showing what they're doing that's unfair when the reading framework showing that you're doing is unfair. Now, you don't go for those arguments in the end because you're not going for policy making good. You're going for sort of like government isn't, anti-black. So it's like if you don't have the other offense that sort of says that brown bodies are the center or like Middle Easterns are the center, but you have the policy stuff, then you sort of have to go for policy making is good. Otherwise, there's just more arguments from the negative side for why policy making is bound up with these sort of like forms of discriminations. And I think it would help that if either the 1NR or the 2NC, either of those speeches, made some like historical parallels where the government has tried to do something good and extend rights in one way, but they have taken rights in another way, right? Like initially, separate but equal was a attempt to try and uplift black communities so that way they could have black teachers teaching black students, but it was not equal, and so that entirely fell through. And so there's a whole line of like historical legislation that was meant to help people who have black bodies, and then simultaneously have that, do basically the exact opposite. And so making those arguments would preempt what happens in the 2AR, where she points out things like, here's a couple of laws, we gave blacks the right to vote, so therefore doesn't that show that the government's good? Like, if you already have a couple of historical examples, then you sort of win the generic end of it, and then you have your specific applications, which are always going to be more important, but sort of the historical framing is also good. And when anybody runs a critique, you can also have a permutation where you say we can do them both. Is another thing.
I had thought of that, and I just realized I'm like, a permutation. Like, there was just no way.
What would you suggest the time chronological permanent?
Well, you could say, for instance, like if their framework is to talk about anti-blackness, you could say we could talk about anti-blackness at the same time that we could talk away the way drone strikes target those people who have black bodies. There's no reason for why what they said in the 1NC doesn't agree with the plan of stopping drone strikes. So it's like, so you include that, but their argument is that you needed to talk about this and you chose not to talk about it, and that exclusion is a form of anti-blackness because it's just leaving it silent. But if you have that and then you prove like your plan is a good idea or moving in the right direction, like if a negative team mishandles a perm, then it's like, well, we're moving in the right direction and we can include this. Just because we didn't talk about it, doesn't mean that we are anti-black. It just means we didn't talk about it. And then you have the permutation. So that would be how you could sort of couch the permutation.
I thought was like, I didn't know if a permutation would work better or if like the rejection of their framework would work better. Hence, kind of like we just
why we did framework.
Yeah,
right.
Because we happen to have more like, at least with us, like our evidence just
Framework seemed more.
is substantially leaned more towards rejecting their framework and just arguing for.
Yeah, you can always do both.
So.
Permutation is a test of competition, so it's an even if. So it's like their framework's bad, even if you don't buy that, we can do it with ours, right? So you can always do both. You don't have to give up either. Yeah, and then I think that in the world where they have a permutation, the way that it excludes, that they've already not talked about in the links works that you're doing on the actual like terrorism, flow and things like that would then show why they would not be able to perm. And the other thing I'd say is that you need to, when she's giving the 2NR, be a little bit more like, yeah, right. Like when you're just sort of like that, it's like, I'm just someone who types or whatnot, but like a little pop, and nodding and stuff like that. And that goes for both. Is that like when you're, don't be too exaggerated, but like look like you're still in it, and like you have your partner when the opponent's last speech is going. A little bit of faces about like, where is this? Just a little bit of that.
I had to cut back on that because like our judges forever get distracted with us.
Right. Well, yeah, you can't be too animated, but you were in the entire opposite direction, so a little bit more. But I understand it's round 5, so it's rough and it's like it's exhausting. But
I don't know if it's really an idea was to have 5 rounds in a day. Like when Dr. Pat told us, he's like, yeah, guys, our tournament we're having 5 rounds that day. I was like, why?
It's an educational death march.
I mean, you could argue that the education can still come with 2 rounds in one day. You can't be properly educated if you're mentally.
Okay, it's true. Does anybody have any other questions or anything?
Okay. Because since you suggested a perm, what would be viable options for like links and internal links and whatnot for that, or like an alternative?
Their argument is not like going to conform to sort of internal link impact sort of structure. So you have to sort of break it down, and that's what she's saying is that like that mode of thinking is a certain mode of thinking, and there's other not anti-black modes of thinking. So it's an argument that sort of approaches how you construct knowledge. And so the way that you construct knowledge is very sort of like A causes B causes C, very linear and rational. And discrimination often takes place in ways by saying that these things are just irrational and can't be understood. And so like your response to them is like, it just doesn't make sense. It's nonsense, right? But it's saying that you've excluded a form of thinking is essentially the way the link happens. That the form of thinking is a black form of thinking, which then you don't press them on what is this black form of thinking. And so with that, then your permutations are structured in the way that you can have the different forms of thinking to justify the affirmative. It doesn't have to be this one form, and just a defense of that logic and reason and rationality as well as what you could do. But.
I think it is. I was going to say, at least for my question, because I think I probably got more aggressive. No, this definitely is my most aggressive round. But just like from a judge's perspective, like, do you think I came off like too aggressive?
No, I didn't think you came off aggressive at all. I think that at sometimes you said things in more insulting ways than I think you meant to have said them. Like when you say that this doesn't make sense, or I guess like you kept on saying, "What's the link? There's no link. How does this make sense?" And you were being like, "I don't know what you mean. What's this? What do you mean?" Right? And so like there was a miscommunication because you want to know in the way that you've been taught what is the link to the position, and you just don't have an answer to that because it's not a link in the way that it takes place, but it's sort of like a exclusion that takes place. But people are going to ask you that, and so I think that you should come up with a way to answer that question that's not like, I don't know how to answer the question, but come up with an answer that explains why that question is the wrong question. Right? So if your answer would be like, asking that's the wrong question, this is how you need to understand it, then you're explaining to the judge, you're explaining to them too, but then you're also showing sort of how this different engagement works. And then also it's not like you don't understand the question, because it's like, what's the link? And you know that it's like there's an answer to that question, it's the way that you mischaracterize the form of like the link. So that cross-examination got to like where you'd say something like, this is just, I forget the exact quote, but it was something like it was nonsense. And then that became,
that's kind of why I was just like, I kind of realized there was just no point in like furthering it because
that's not aggressive or anything like that. And if you ever get to a point like cross-examination, you can just start a new line.
Yeah, that's kind of why I figured. I was like, I kind of realized it wasn't going to go anywhere, so I'm like, all right, it's better off to like not centralize it.
Yeah. Do you have anything, or are you good?
So for like that experiment that like I just did do you think that the answers to you thought that the answers to their framework weren't like parallel enough?
Yeah, because when you got to the framework, you were just sort of being like, you were like, policy making is bad, but in your initial shell, you had like a reason for why it was bad for education, a form of exclusion, and not fair. And so when they said it's good for education because we should role play, you should be like, that's not true because role playing is what causes us to have to exclude our identities. And then when they say it's good for education for whatever reason they said.
And they talked about like the analytics, but did you think that I didn't reach my parts?
I think that when they said that, your argument about like you're excluding voices makes even more sense, right? Like now they're like, you can't make an analytical argument with your own head. You have to, hide behind evidence and research. But no, I know that you read evidence and then you also made analytical arguments. Like you did both. But there were sometimes when you just made analytical arguments. So like, no, we have evidence, and so like that's the link. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
How was my actual talking? Was I rambling on too much?
No, your 1 was surprisingly good. And I mean that in a very sincere way, because the way that you look through the entirety of the round is sort of was like, oh, okay, I don't think he's going to get through 6 minutes, but you got through 6 minutes and you made arguments the entire way through, like that was relevant, that was specific to what they were saying, and wasn't too repetitive. So it was like your content was good.
So if I don't necessarily make it past time, that doesn't make it as bad. Like if I don't.
No, I mean, you should always use up all your time, because if you don't use your time, then you just gave up time to make arguments. But if you have nothing else to say, sit down. But every time there's a little bit of a pause and you started back up again, you said something good that you didn't say before. So, I would say for you, if you just think you're done, take a couple extra seconds and think, and then, continue on. Because every time there was that brief pause, you did something else that was good in this round. And you didn't, if you just sat down, you would have not have done that. So, use your time. Yep, thanks. Have a good one. Yep.